Social Change Working Group, which is organizing today's webinar. So on behalf of our working group, welcome. And we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. And for that, I'm going to pass it over to Pam. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to do the land acknowledgement. We would like to start by honoring the land that we are on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederation, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nations. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements and is home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, including the Inuit and the Métis. These treaties and other agreements, including the One Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans and newcomers, were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past. We are mindful of broken covenants, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. We would also like to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And so we honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent.
Thank you, Pam. And before we get started with our two presentations today, we would like to bring to your attention a few housekeeping items. A reminder that this webinar is not the appropriate venue to bring up any specific cases related to workers' rights or self-care. The chat area will be monitored for questions for our presenters during the session. And I will kindly ask you to please remain muted unless you are asking a question during the Q&A section. And to ask a question, please use the hand raise function and you will be asked to unmute yourself. And Karina will continue now with the housekeeping items.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We also acknowledge that online exhaustion, and while we ask you to be present, please feel comfortable to turn off your video if you feel your eyes are strained. This webinar will be recorded, but we will not be including the Q&A part in the final recording to ensure privacy. Repository of resources will be sent out to all participants along with an evaluation following today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. And now I would like to pass it over to Nina Hall, our first speaker today. She'll talk about employment and workers' rights. And Nina, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Nina Hall. I'm a staff lawyer at Kensington Bellwoods Community Legal Services. That's the community legal clinic that serves low-income people living between Ossington Avenue, Yonge Street, Bloor, all the way down to the islands. I practice mostly in landlord-tenant, and I've practiced at a couple of other clinics, including the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, where I was tenant duty counsel, and Neighbourhood Legal Services, which a number of you will know is the clinic that serves addresses, our sister clinic that serves addresses east of Yonge. I also provide some services around employment law, which I prefer to call workers' rights in our clinic. And I'm going to barrel through a presentation that's about 20 slides long. There are some resources appended to the end of it, and I think those slides I'll submit and encourage Adriana to share with you in terms of links to places to find additional information. And then there will, of course, be some time for questions. So my presentation is entitled Workers' Rights During COVID-19 and Returning to Work. Well, let's get it up there. I take it you can see it, but in the wrong format at the moment. There's 2 minutes gone for me. but let me just give you an overview of the presentation. So some of the things I know you'd hope to hear about might have been around some of the particular aspects of working from home. Unfortunately, I'm not able to address that in the 25 minutes allotted. But what I do want to talk about is how COVID-19 has impacted the workplace, which we learned most about in the first official declaration of a state of emergency in March through July. I want to talk about some considerations for returning to work, and sort of recurrent themes will be things like occupational health and safety, WSIB, and the human rights considerations. So how has COVID impacted the workplace? So you can imagine that there have been a number of concerns that workers have had over the course of the many months that we've lived through, being called back to work, workplaces adjusting to the realities of adapting their workplaces to take into account the health and safety challenges posed by a pandemic. And it's important to sort of grasp that your rights in these situations will depend on the circumstances of any work stoppage that an individual has experienced. As a very general rule, and this is a basic principle of employment law, if you will, employers in Ontario can fire non-unionized employees at any time, provided that they give employees reasonable working notice of their dismissal or pay instead of notice. So the Employment Standards Act sets basic minimum standards, including their entitlement to termination pay and or severance if applicable. People can have entitlements that are greater than that, particularly in a unionized environment, and also specifically where they have an employment contract. The pandemic introduced new protections related to COVID-19. New is a relative statement when we talk about occupational health and safety and human rights, because the human rights principles sat in the background. Occupational health and safety always sat in the background. But I'm going to talk just a little bit about the job protected leaves that were introduced to the Employment Standards Act. And unfortunately, this is a bit of a historical piece now. I'm sure it's foremost in all our minds that we're currently in a new kind of state of emergency, though it's being called a stay-at-home order, or an ordre de rester chez soi in French, which I like because it makes it sound charming or almost charming. But the two leaves that were introduced by the provincial government are the declared emergency leave. But these leaves were time limited with that first wave of the pandemic, if you will. It ended as of July 24th, 2020, with the end of the declared state of emergency, though. So that first declared state of emergency, which every 2 weeks we would hear the Premier renew and renew. And so that leave is not available currently, and it was not available after July 24th. I'm telling you about it because for many of our clients, what happened to their working life over the past many months can be something that they want to discuss, and something that will generate, referrals to legal clinics so they can figure out if they've received all of their entitlements and the protections that they were entitled to, even in past points in time. So the infectious disease emergency leave ended 6 weeks after the end of the declared emergency. So if the declared emergency ended on the 24th of July, that means September 4th. And I won't obsess about the leaves, but what the criteria was for qualifying for them is set out here. These were unpaid job protected leaves. This one for the infectious disease emergency leave, the following reasons were the basis for being entitled to such a leave: that the employee was under medical investigation, supervision, or treatment for COVID-19, the employee was acting in accordance with an order under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, the employee was in quarantine or in self-isolation because of a public health information or direction, the employer had directed the employee not to work due to a concern that COVID-19 could be spread in the workplace, the employee needed to provide care to a person for a reason related to COVID-19, such as school or day closure, the employee was prevented from returning to work in Ontario because of travel restrictions. So these are leaves that were brought in in response to the pandemic at that point in time, so in March 2019. And as ever, but for these leaves particularly, the employer couldn't require a medical note. They could require reasonable evidence. Ontario had declared that state of emergency on March 17th. And so it's important to note when the leave was available, who was entitled to it, and whether an employee had an obligation to alert the employer. And of course, that's actually always the case. So again, you're probably wondering, why am I going over this historically? Because unfortunately, at this moment, there are no legislated job protected leaves with respect to COVID-19. So there's no relationship between the current stay-at-home order and these leaves, but that does not mean a person can simply be terminated. The second leave had a similar criteria, but its termination point was a little bit different. And again, who could benefit from the leave I've set out here. And what was very important to know is that employees who had been placed on a temporary layoff or had their wages reduced or had hours reduced due to COVID-19 after March 1st, 2020, were automatically deemed to be on the declared emergency leave with a right to benefit from the continuation of the layoff starting on May 29th. So what is a temporary layoff? Generally, an employee needs to agree to a layoff. Plus, there can be contractual provisions that permits employers to put someone on a layoff. They can only be placed on a temporary layoff, temporary leave for 13 weeks in a 20-week period, or up to 35 weeks in a 52-week period. So that had been part of the Employment Standards Act for a long time. But in the spring of 2020, the government basically amended the Employment Standards Act to say that if you were in a layoff due to COVID-19, you were deemed to be on the declared emergency leave. You are not being constructively dismissed beyond this point. So some of the practical considerations included sort of inquiring with your employer about when you would be returned to work, to not agree to any kind of long-term layoff, and that you would continue to have the benefits that came with your employment and the right to be returned to the same job. So I want to move on again quite quickly to the right to refuse unsafe work. If you believe that a risk of exposure to COVID-19 is in the workplace, the Occupational Health and Safety Act sets out steps to address this. So this isn't some adaptation for COVID. This is an act that's always sat in the background to protect workers. You can file a complaint about the unsafe conditions at work, or you could refuse unsafe work. So some of the questions that one would think about were, what has your boss done to limit the spread of COVID-19? Have you spoken to your boss about your concerns? Have you been intimidated or forced to work with fear of reprisal? Do you have reasonable grounds to refuse unsafe work? So really here, we have to think not 100% subjectively, but we have to sort of think about the actual realities of the work situation. So a fear of the general spread of COVID, it doesn't really fit within these criteria. But employers do have a duty to keep the workplace safe, and employees have a duty to report unsafe work, and they have the right to refuse unsafe work without reprisal. So how do you go about refusing unsafe work? The first step is to report the work refusal. So report the refusal to the employer and the health and safety representative in the workplace. Workers should stay in a safe place at or close to the workplace while an investigation takes place. They should investigate the reasons for the work refusal with you. This is what the ministry does. And either the issue is resolved and the danger is addressed and the worker goes back to work, or the issue is not resolved and the complaint can proceed to the second stage. The second stage, if you have reasonable grounds to believe work is still unsafe, you can continue to refuse and remain in a safe place and call the Ministry of Labor. They will inspect and provide their decision about identified danger to the worker, management, and safety representative in writing. Changes are made if required or order worker returns to work. So I can't go into detail about how effective that was during the course of the pandemic. It did happen. Did it happen to the extent that it should have? I think there's a lot that you can read in the media, and you can read from various sources that are excellent about issues around workers' rights, particularly the Workers' Action Center, to develop a bit of an understanding of how effective that had been. It's important to know that, again, before COVID, there has always been, or this version of the act is from 1997, a Workplace Safety and Insurance Act. This is an act that provides compensation for, and I'm quoting for a particular reason, personal injury or illness arising out of and in the course of employment, and provides compensation, quote, where a worker suffers from and is impaired by an occupational disease that occurs due to the nature of one or more employments in which the worker was engaged. Therefore, workers infected with COVID-19 in the course of employment may, in fact and law, be entitled to services and benefits. These types of claims were made by healthcare workers during the 2003 SARS outbreak. So what is going to happen is we're going to get a sense over the months that come with claims being processed, where all these decision-making systems are slowed down within COVID, but we are going to start to see this. We're going to start to see the law develop, and that's by bringing forward the facts and the cases. But it's going to happen under different, several areas of employment law or different pieces of law that govern workers' rights and protections for workers. So when we're talking about human rights in the Human Rights Code, COVID-19 is a disability under the code. The Commission's policy position is that negative treatment of employees who have or are perceived to have COVID-19 for reasons unrelated to public health and safety is discriminatory and prohibited under the code. Employers have a duty to accommodate employees in relation to COVID-19 or family status, unless it would amount to undue hardship based on cost, health, and safety. I think it's important to note that all of these instances were reacting to a situation on the ground, and the Human Rights Commission came up with its policy quite quickly, and it did have an important influence in the thinking about these issues. When it comes to COVID-19 and ethnic background, an employer should not send an individual employee home based on their perceptions or ask them not to work because of concerns over COVID-19 unless the concerns are reasonable and consistent with the most recent advice from medical and public health officials. In unique circumstances, an employer might have other health and safety concerns that could amount to undue hardship. They would need to be able to show objective evidence to support such a claim. Employer absenteeism policies must not negatively affect employees who cannot work in connection with COVID-19. An employer may not discipline or terminate an employee who is unable to come to work because of medical or health officials have quarantined them or have advised them to self-isolate and stay home in connection with COVID-19. So earlier I was talking about how there's no connection with the job protected leaves and the current stay-at-home order, but the human rights code aspect is somewhat of a backup, though I think it's egregious that this government hasn't been more explicit or recognized that paid sick days are an integral part of protecting workers in a pandemic of this nature. So I want to focus a little bit on returning to work. What if I was laid off during the pandemic? So here's where sort of the rubber hits the road. If one was the subject of a temporary layoff after March 1st, 2020, the declared emergency leave with benefit continuation for layoffs starting after May 29th, 2020 until you return to work. There was a 13-week to 20-week limit. That would mean that length of layoff would not be constructive dismissal under the Employment Standards Act, and your leave can be your layoff can be extended beyond that. You had a right to be returned to your job within 6 weeks of the end of the declared emergency period. This meant by September 4th, 2020. So if you're talking to an individual now and they were laid off earlier in the pandemic and not returned to work, then they have distinct issues and they should get individual legal advice. But these situations may not take away from common law rights. So what that refers to is the Employment Standards Act, as I said earlier, sets the basic minimum standards for workers in Ontario. The common law, which is a series of judgments basically from the courts about employer-employee relationships over, I guess, decades and decades and decades now, can also impact a person's entitlements and rights. Not frequently, but in principle, the longer the period of employment, the more likely that common law rights have accrued. The same thing would apply for wages and hour reductions. All right, if there's a permanent layoff, if that's what the employer is claiming, then you should be receiving, an employee or a worker should receive a notice of termination. And obviously certain things flow from termination, the minimum standards of the Act, and possibly some common law entitlements as well. If the employer does not return you to work at all and months go by, you could still have those common law rights, and it could be construed as constructive dismissal. So as I said earlier, the cases that run through will actually create a body of law, so to speak. So this idea that what is out there at common law that will apply to the COVID pandemic is a real thing. So the government tried to legislate away aspects of what could otherwise be argued a constructive dismissal, but it's not clear that they've legislated away all of it by any stretch of the imagination. So again, if we touch on human rights considerations in the return to work, a worker still has the right to be accommodated for legitimate human rights concerns. Now with the schools closed, things like family status and the need for childcare accommodations, immunocompromised employees. Also, they have the right to be free from discrimination due to having COVID or the perception that they may have COVID or have had it, especially, I shouldn't say especially, but, or due to race-based factors. I mean, this is a very real thing in the workplace. One hopes people are getting more educated over the course of the pandemic, but we know that the impact of the pandemic has been greater on racialized communities and racialized workers and low-wage workers overall. So your employer should be returning you to work if you've been cleared by a doctor. This last sentence about open communication versus my way or the highway. Accommodation, any human rights accommodation is a two-way process. And that's what that's referring to, excuse me. So I just wanted to touch on the fact that there has been a period of time where there was temporary pandemic pay available, and workers who didn't get it will be able to have claims under the Employment Standards Act. And keeping an eye open for these kinds of situations is very important to all of us who work in the field. When it comes back to occupational health and safety, if your employer is requesting for you to return to work, they have a duty to maintain a workplace free of safety risks, including with appropriate COVID-19 related precautions. These can be masks, face shields, social distancing as much as possible, no crowding, regular cleaning and sanitation. If there is an actual safety risk in the workplace, you have the right to refuse unsafe work. Similarly, if you have COVID or been exposed to someone with COVID, the employer may have the right to send you home if there is an actual risk, not just something as simple as one cough. Obviously, it's important to protect yourself. So over the months that have transpired, every workplace, not only under occupational health and safety legislation, but public health legislation, edicts published by the city of, I shouldn't say published, but promulgated by the city of Toronto, City of Toronto added early this month obligations to report 2 or more infections that appear to have arisen out of the workplace. So all those things have become real and concrete. And I'm sure all of us in our workplaces, where we had even a partial return to a physical workplace, perhaps sometime after we went into phase 3 back in late July, early August of last year, are kind of familiar with the kinds of things that should be in a safety plan around COVID-19. So this is just sort of an example of a potential question. I'm an essential worker, but I'm afraid to go back to work, or my workplace is not safe. What are my options? When can I refuse to work? So here are sort of the highlights of the information that this kind of worker should receive. If you have a disability that puts you at a high risk or are immunocompromised, if you live with someone who is immunocompromised, if you now have to care for children or family members that are sick, your employer is not developed that safety plan that's required or taking steps to otherwise reduce the spread of the virus. I mean, it's the same thing. If you're healthy but your workplace is unsafe, you may have the right to refuse unsafe work. So I've really tried to respect the time limit, but I realize I've barreled through my presentation. I'm very open to questions or any sort of requests for clarification that you might have. And I think with that, I'm going to stop talking. What I do want to indicate too is that here are some of the links and resources that I want to send your way. I have no hesitation whatsoever to suggest that even when your client is dealing with some basic legal information, that there are 2 good points of contact before you're even contacting a community legal clinic. One is the Workers' Action Center. I know that the Workers' Action Center is able to run a questions hotline, which is not unfortunately something that every individual clinic is able to do. So that has more to do with response times when people are trying to get general information. And Community Legal Education Ontario is tasked with providing plain English and yet quite detailed information about rights and obligations in many areas of law, including employment and workers' rights. And throughout the pandemic, they have been very efficient at updating their information. You'll see that there's a banner across the top of that website. If I start taking you into the websites, I will never stop talking, but that takes you right away to some of the COVID updates. There's also a live chat. So neither of those resources is a substitute for specific legal advice, but sometimes people are looking for basic information about different things, sometimes while they're waiting for legal advice. So another resource around legal advice beyond legal clinics around things like employment, workers' rights, and human rights in the workplace is the Human Rights Legal Support Center, which is the second from the bottom in terms of my resource list. So with that, I actually will pause now. I haven't been observing the chat, but I think my colleague has. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. If there aren't, then there aren't. So
Center, and she'll talk about self-care and self-compassion during COVID-19. So Sarah, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Adriana, and thank you, Nina, for your presentation. I'm just going to get myself set up here and share my screen, and then I'll get started. Okay, so I am assuming you can now see my screen. If not, please let me know, Adriana. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Sarah. I'm a case counselor specialist with Wood Green Community Services in our interprofessional primary care team. In my current role, I provide mental health support, settlement support, system and resource navigation to newcomer clients in the East End of Toronto in healthcare settings. Today, I'm really looking forward to diving into these topics a bit deeper. I know, especially in light of everything that's going on, these topics have risen, I guess, in more prominence and relevance in light of the pandemic. These words are probably words you've heard before. I like to refer to them as buzzwords. They get thrown around a lot. And so I find often we might have an idea of what this means, what is self-care, what self-compassion means. But because we hear it so frequently, sometimes they can lose meaning, or we have an intuitive understanding of what it might be, but we don't know what it looks like to actually apply that in our day-to-day lives. So I hope today I can demystify these topics a bit more for you. But before I jump in deeper, I just wanted to take some time to let you check in with yourself and use this as an opportunity for self-reflection. So there'll be a poll that'll come up, and I invite you to just respond to this question. And I have a couple prompts in the poll as well. How are you feeling coming into this time? Your responses will be anonymous. I won't see who has selected what option. And feel free, I think you should be able to choose more than one. So choose whichever feel more relevant to you at this time. So I will let you have a moment to respond to that.
Sorry, it seems that the poll closed prematurely, so I'm just going to relaunch it. Sorry about that, folks. So please do reshare your response if you had already done so. So we have about 65% who have responded, so I'll just give a few more seconds. And just sharing the results of the poll now, and you should all be able to see the responses there.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for participating. From what I can see here as well, you should be able to see the results too. The most common response is feeling fatigued, tired, followed by overwhelmed, hopeful as well, which hopefully again, the new year and with the vaccine on the horizon and already being administered, hopefully increasing those feelings of hopefulness, and then indifferent, content, and lastly, energized. So thank you for participating. Hopefully this is helpful for you to just check in with yourself. And I will say these responses might not be surprising to you, but it's helpful to see visually and know that you're not the only one that's experiencing this. A lot of us feel like we've been operating at probably 50% capacity for a while now in light of the pandemic. And it's also, aside from knowing that you're not the only one experiencing this, it's helpful for you to check in and acknowledge and affirm how you're feeling, often by externalizing it, either by writing it down or talking about it, or in this case, being prompted by a poll, helps you to be honest with yourself and see your experience and emotions a bit more clearly. Awareness, as well as having a shared experience of difficulty with others, are both important parts of self-compassion. And so by responding to this poll, you've already taken a first step in practicing self-compassion and checking in with yourself and acknowledging how you're feeling. So You can keep that in mind, and I will come back to that later on as I go through our time together. Okay, so this is just a very brief outline of what I hope to go through today, fairly straightforward. So I'll go through self-care, what it is, what it isn't, self-compassion, what it is, what it isn't, and then at the end, just tying these two concepts together and what it looks like to practice it in your day-to-day life. So I think it's really important to, often conversations of self-care are very focused around activities that you do. But I think it's especially important to also pair these conversations with talking about self-care. I think it's a crucial component, or sorry, self-compassion as a crucial component of self-care. Both self-care and self-compassion go hand in hand. Self-compassion is a means that helps you to get to self-care and to practicing self-care. And self-compassion is also one of the many ways in which you can practice care for yourself. So I'll start off with what self-care isn't, and I find it's helpful to define what something is by its opposite or what it isn't. And like I mentioned, especially when it comes to the conversation around self-care, because it's often been depicted and used as a very trendy buzzword, depicted as things that it might not actually mean at its core. So often self-care activities can be viewed as one-time activities that we do when we have a hard day. So for example, maybe binge watching your favorite TV show or eating a lot of your favorite food, or maybe we have wishful thinking about self-care. We know it's something that we should be doing, but we just never find time to actually do it. But self-care isn't something that just happens. And there are a lot of things that are defined as self-care, which aren't truly the essence of self-care. So self-care isn't engaging in one-time activities or one-off activities when you feel like you're about to burn out. And self-care isn't treating yourself. So like I mentioned, either, for example, binging your favorite TV show or going on a shopping spree. And it doesn't mean that those things might not, sometimes those things make you feel better. It doesn't mean that they don't help, but they're very short-term solutions. They might help you feel better in the short term, but if you practice those as habits of self-care, they can become harmful in different ways in the long term. So along with that, self-care isn't anything that feels good. Just because it's pleasant in the moment and helps you relieve stress in that moment doesn't mean it's good for you to engage in that activity all the time. And lastly, self-care isn't reactive. Self-care isn't meant to be something that we only start doing once we realize there's a serious problem and only start taking steps to care for ourselves once we've reached our limits or we're feeling overly tired or burnt out. That's not the essence of what self-care is. So what is self-care? Self-care is any activity that we do to intentionally care for our mental, emotional, and physical health. So self-care are things that refill and refuel you in healthy ways. And like I mentioned earlier, self-care is focused on long-term health. There are a lot of activities that can help you in the short term, but again, harmful in the long term. But on the other hand, self-care activities are those that will be healthy and beneficial for you in the long term. So a good way to think about it is things that are uncontroversially good for you. Self-care is something that you need to actively plan and choose to do. So having a proactive approach towards self-care and something that requires conscious thought and effort and choice for you to engage in activities that will recharge you, as well as acting to care for yourself before you reach or pass your limits or before you feel like you are overly tired. And this is a key part and also the most challenging part of self-care is that often we're not aware of our own limits or how tired we are until we've crossed our limits or until we're overly tired. So this is really where self-compassion comes into play. And I'll come back to that and tie that in. And how does self-compassion actually help us to increase our awareness in moments when we do need to care for ourselves? Self-care is made up of a mix of informal practices, habits, and formal practices. So some self-care activities you might engage in as a habit on a day-to-day basis. So for example, having a certain routine for when you go to bed, but others you might engage in more sporadically or not as a consistent habit. So for example, journaling or meditation, you might do more informally. And lastly, self-care is about developing rhythms and routines that help you maintain a balance in your life. So rhythms and routines, I like those words because they allude to things that are more incorporated in our day-to-day lives and things that we engage in over and over again to help us have balance instead of something that we just sporadically do one time and we feel relief and then we never engage in it again. So I like to use this example of a fuel tank as an analogy for self-care. I think it's a really helpful illustration. So think about the last time that you decided to travel by car and you looked down on the dashboard and you saw that the indicator light is flashing for the fuel tank and your gas is near empty. What did you do when you saw that you were nearing empty? It's very likely that you didn't continue driving for as long as you possibly could. You probably stopped at the nearest gas station to refuel the car before it ran out of gas to prevent it from running out of gas so you could continue on your journey. It's very unlikely you would wait until it's completely empty to refill it. But often we do treat our bodies and ourselves in this way. Often we wait until we feel completely worn out or completely tired to care for ourselves. But self-care isn't meant to be done in an attempt to reverse a wrong that we've done to our body or to ourselves. Self-care is meant to be practiced to energize us and keep us healthy moving forward. Self-care isn't a way to overcome burnout or stress, but a way to mitigate it and to manage it. So just like you don't leave a car until it's completely empty, habits of self-care are meant to keep you balanced. They're meant to keep you fueled and prevent you from reaching a point where your tank is empty. So how does self-compassion fit into this? What is self-compassion and how does self-compassion help us practice self-care? So self-compassion helps you become more aware and present with moments that you need to care for yourself. In other words, self-compassion helps you to become conscious about how and when you need to engage in self-care. Self-compassion at its core is an attitude or a change in perspective in how you relate to yourself and how you treat yourself, which can also result in activities or actions of self-care. And part of being able to care for yourself also relates and means being compassionate towards yourself. So using the same fuel analogy, if your gas tank is empty, you only know that it's empty because you look down at the dashboard. You actually take time to check whether the indicator light is flashing, or you check where the arrow is pointing, how filled your gas tank is. But imagine if you don't take time to notice it. You're not actively checking, you just completely are distracted. You don't notice that your car needs fuel. You'll run out of gas before it's too late. And at that point, it's more difficult to solve the problem. So with self-compassion and self-care, self-compassion is like that indicator or warning light that helps you become aware of when you're feeling low or feeling like you are metaphorically empty and needing care. So it helps you notice that you're in need of self-care. Whereas self-care are the activities, practices, or habits that you engage in to bring up your fuel level. So like I mentioned at the beginning, both of these concepts of self-care and self-compassion, they go hand in hand. And I think it's really important to talk about both together. I think it's difficult to separate them out and talk about only one without the other. So in thinking about what is self-compassion, I'll backtrack a little bit and think about what does it mean to have compassion for others? What is compassion in general? Well, the word compassion means to be with one who is suffering, as well as to care, to give, and to act in response. So when you think about someone who you know who is compassionate or a compassionate person, the idea of what a compassionate person might look like, often they display the following characteristics. They notice the suffering of others. They respond to that suffering with understanding and kindness. And they don't judge the person who's suffering because they're experiencing difficulty or suffering, but instead recognize that suffering, pain, difficulty are all part of the shared human experience. So what does this definition of compassion mean when we apply it to ourselves? So self-compassion involves acting in that same way towards yourself when you're having a difficult time, when you fail, or when you notice something you don't like about yourself. And this is a quote from Dr. Kristen Neff, who is one of the main researchers in the field of self-compassion. So the very simple definition of self-compassion is acting the same way towards yourself as you would toward a friend who is suffering. So when we think about how I described a compassionate person applied to ourselves, that means that we notice our own suffering, we respond to ourselves with understanding and kindness, and we don't judge ourselves harshly because of the difficulties that we might experience, but instead we recognize that suffering, failure, making mistakes, difficulty, and imperfections are all a part of the human experience that we share with one another. So through self-compassion, we become more of an inner ally towards ourselves instead of an inner enemy. And what I described are reflective of the three main principles or tenets of self-compassion. Noticing your own suffering is mindfulness, being present with yourself, your experiences, and your emotions. Offering understanding and kindness to yourself instead of judging yourself harshly is self-kindness. And recognizing that you're not alone or isolated in your experience of difficulty or suffering is common humanity. Three other ways and three other words that I've put there to help you think about these are loving, connected, and present. So thinking about having a loving perspective or relation with yourself, attitude, loving attitude towards yourself, connectedness to a broader human shared experience, and being present with yourself and your emotions and your experiences in a non-judgmental way. So self-kindness, as I've alluded to, is the opposite of self-judgment. Most of us, I think, would agree that when we make mistakes, when we fail or feel inadequate in some way, it's more common for us to be harsh towards ourselves, and that voice, that inner critic starts speaking. So I like this image that talks about, dear me, I choose a new inner voice, from critical to compassionate. So again, our default is often to be critical towards ourselves, but self-kindness counters this reaction in that instead of attacking ourselves for inadequacy or for a difficulty or using how we might feel as a form of punishment towards ourselves, instead self-kindness teaches us to have a gentle and non-judgmental approach toward ourselves in times that we would rather judge, attack, or punish ourselves, and focusing on what we can learn from our mistakes. Common humanity is the opposite of isolation. So common humanity acknowledges that we're all imperfect, we all experience hardships, and we all make mistakes. Often we can fall into a trap of believing that things are supposed to go well, but the reality is that pain and suffering are part of the human experience. Life entails suffering for everyone without exception. So instead of believing that we're alone in our suffering, common humanity reminds us that pain is an uncomfortable but shared part of the human experience. So when we remember that pain is part of that shared experience, every moment of suffering is turned into a moment of connection with others, because the pain that I feel at different times is also the pain that you feel. And our circumstances might differ, but we all at some point feel like we failed, we all feel inadequate, we all experience difficulty. And mindfulness is the opposite of avoidance or rumination. So thinking about something over and over again, or over-identification, just like exaggerating your feelings. So our most common response when we experience uncomfortable emotions or uncomfortable experiences is we suppress it, we avoid it. We don't want to think about it, we don't want to feel it, or we think about it over and over again in an unhelpful way, or a way that is very harsh and judgmental towards ourselves, or we exaggerate our feelings of failure and inadequacy, which is over-identifying with our feelings. So mindfulness teaches us that instead of resisting or avoiding our thoughts or emotions or negative sensations, which again is a very common reaction, the goal of mindfulness is to be present with those emotions, to acknowledge that they're there, to acknowledge that they're uncomfortable, but to not get lost in the voice of the inner critic or get lost in that self-judgment. And this is one of the essential components in self-compassion and self-care, because we need to be able to acknowledge that we're struggling or that we're suffering in order to turn towards that and respond with kindness and care. If we fail to acknowledge that we are experiencing difficulty or a negative emotion because we're avoiding it or we're suppressing it, then it makes us unable to respond well, because it means that we're unaware of it. So it's similar again to that fuel analogy. It's as if, if we're avoiding it or we're thinking about it in an unhelpful way, it doesn't help us take steps forward to care for ourselves, and leaves us stuck. So mindfulness is really a crucial point and purpose in bringing awareness to our experiences. So I'm going to give you this brief example. It's a very easy to follow example of applying self-compassion. So this is Teresa, and Teresa had planned to meet with a friend, but she forgot about the meeting. So she stood up her friend and now she feels terrible about it. How does she apply these concepts of self-compassion? So again, her more immediate reaction is likely self-judgment. She might be calling herself names because she forgot about the meeting with her friend. How dumb am I? I'm such an awful friend. I can't believe I did this. But instead, she's learning to practice self-compassion, and she says to herself, I can be forgetful sometimes, but I'm forgiving when a friend forgets something. So I'm going to be forgiving towards myself as well. This doesn't mean I'm a bad friend, and I'll plan to make it up to her. So in this example, Teresa's treating herself like she would a friend, and she acknowledges her mistake, but she also chooses to extend forgiveness and kindness to herself instead of ruminating and beating herself up about it. Instead of common humanity, she might isolate herself in her pain and say, no one forgets about a good friend the way that I just did, which again is a way of making herself feel alone in that experience, that she is the only person that's an awful friend, and there's, no one would forget about a friend like that if I was truly a good friend. So it's very isolating. But on the contrary, common humanity, in applying common humanity as she's learning self-compassion, she says to herself, I remembered that everyone can be forgetful at times. It's only natural that these things happen. And then lastly, instead of being present with her emotions, she might be overthinking again and again in an unhelpful way about how she forgot about the meeting, or she might be avoiding the feelings of guilt or embarrassment that she might be feeling. But when she starts applying mindfulness, instead of avoiding the negative experience and emotions, Teresa is present with herself, and she says, I wish it didn't happen, but it did. By applying mindfulness, I acknowledged how bad I felt in the moment, and I could be present with the feelings of guilt and embarrassment without getting lost in self-judgment. I knew the feelings wouldn't kill me and would eventually pass. I gave myself a little pep talk, saw my friend the next day to apologize and explain myself, and everything was fine. So in applying the three concepts of self-compassion, Teresa isn't avoiding the negative feelings of guilt or even the sensations of embarrassment, like if your face is flushed or you feel your chest tightening because you're anxious. She's acknowledging these feelings and emotions, but she isn't using them as a way to punish herself for forgetting about the meeting. Instead, she extends kindness towards herself, she's present with herself, and she connects her experience to the experience of others. But everyone forgets something at some point. It's not an uncommon experience. Specifically around the pandemic, self-compassion toward your body and mind might look like remembering everything you've done in the past year of 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic, during a state of emergency and evolving lockdown orders. A lot has happened globally, but also I'm sure in your personal lives over the last year. And a lot of us have shifted from working in an office or in a workplace to working virtually and from home in jobs that weren't initially designed to be done from home or virtually. And for some of us, our home environments aren't set up well for us to work well from home. And so it's important for you to remember that, be aware of that, and hold that with gentleness and kindness, and honoring the fact that your body and your mind have carried you through the difficult year of 2020 and continue to carry you into the uncertainties that this new year might bring. Common humanity is a bit more of an obvious one in this case. We all might be socially distanced. We're doing this webinar virtually. We're not in person, but you're not alone in what you're experiencing and feeling. A lot of us are experiencing the same emotions. Obviously, globally, we're all going through a similar experience, but the emotions that brings up is very similar across the board. And lastly, being mindful with yourself and in the fact that you might be feeling tired and weary. And being mindful of that in a non-judgmental way, not labeling yourself or your circumstances. Given everything that's happening and that has already happened, it makes sense if you're feeling slow or at a lower capacity. And also knowing that there's nothing wrong with you and you're not to blame if you do feel tired or weary. So self-compassion isn't meant to change our circumstances of difficulty or of hardship, but self-compassion is done because there is difficulty or pain or suffering. And as you start applying self-compassion, you'll start noticing moments in which you need to practice self-care. So I just wanted to end off by giving a couple prompts for strategies for self-care. So I know there's a lot of resources out there that you can find specific activities. I will put forth the caveat that self-care isn't a one-size-fits-all. So there's a lot of different activities and ideas you can find. Some might work for you, some might not. So on this slide, what I've done instead is I've listed a couple prompting questions that you can take with you and you can use to help you think through what might be helpful self-care activities for you. So these are by no means discrete categories. I've just separated them out. But for example, something that might be helpful for you physically might also help mentally or emotionally. So physically, you can think through the question, what will help you release stress and tension that's built up in your body? That might be exercise. It might be doing something with your hands physically, like creating, whether that's cooking or some other activity. Mentally, what will help you reduce agitation and let your thoughts come and go more easily? A lot of people find journaling helpful. It might also be reading a book and immersing yourself in someone else's story. Emotionally, what will help you gently turn towards your emotions and experiencing them in a healthy way? Something might be writing again, or labeling your emotions, looking at an emotion wheel and labeling what you're feeling without judgment and practicing being non-judgmental. Relationally, what will help you strengthen and nourish your connection with others? So I know this is one that we're obviously a bit more restricted right now, but think through what might be helpful for you. You know, maybe it's sending a quick text or even writing a letter as a different way to help you connect than what we might usually be used to given the circumstances. And spiritually, what will help you explore your and express your beliefs and values? So that might be being in nature or connecting with a religious community or elders or prayer meditation. So I'll just wrap up very quickly, just a couple encouragements and pointers of where to start. I've shared a lot of information, but where's a good place to start? So I encourage you to stick to the basics. Self-care and self-compassion are things that you practice. So you will develop your own rhythm and routine as you continue to practice it over time. The more that you engage with it, the better you will get at identifying how you're feeling and when you need to provide care for yourself and what works for you as self-care. Actively plan. So like I mentioned before, self-care isn't something that will just happen. You need to actively choose to engage in it, but it also doesn't mean you need to add more to your schedule. So self-care can look like replacing things instead of adding them. So instead of watching TV for an hour, you might choose to go for a walk. Regardless of what it looks like for you, you can begin treating self-care as an active choice. Keep a conscious mind. Be aware of what you do and how it feels, whether it helps or whether it doesn't, so that you know what is working for you and what isn't. And lastly, be kind with yourself. Changes toward creating a more balanced lifestyle won't happen overnight, but remember that you make progress as you make minor adjustments repeatedly. And I'll end off with this quote before moving to questions. So I find that this quote, I really like it. It encompasses and really ties together both self-care and self-compassion. So it says, when we come from a self-compassionate place, self-care is no longer about these sporadic one-time events that you do when you feel burnt out or exhausted. Self-care is something you can do all the time. So thank you everyone for listening and for coming today. I will open it up for questions if you have any questions or comments that you would like to share.
Up today's webinar, and I would like to thank both of our presenters, Nina Hall and Sarah Ferguson, for your great and insightful presentations. I am confident that a lot of us had something new to learn today, and perhaps we can apply that in both our professional and personal lives. Just a reminder that I will be sharing the presentations and also a repository of resources with all of you by email. And I will also be sending a link with a quick survey for you to tell us how we did today with our webinar. And if you have any questions related to self-care or workers' rights that were not addressed today, please, you can submit those questions via the evaluation survey. I'm also going to be posting now the evaluation survey on the chat area. So if some of you may want to complete it right away, please go ahead and do so. And with that said, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our organizing committee as well. And thank you to all of our webinar participants for your engagement today. And I hope you have a great day, and please stay safe. Thank you.